Okay, so the other night I stayed, I'm just Googling and goggling, and I was Googling infrastructure disasters in America, as a lady does on a Friday evening. Thank you. And while doing so, one event just kept coming up over and over again. This was the worst train crash in Amtrak history, and it had a lasting impact. I mean, some would say it changed how we ride trains in America altogether. I'm talking about the Big Bayou Canot rail accident. Let's talk about trains for a second, okay? So back in the 1900s, taking a train sucked. Look, if you were traveling cross country, that was really your only option, unless you wanted to do like Oregon Trail, but that never really went well. I mean, inside the train cars, there was no airflow, no AC, just hot air blowing around. Ugh. And then like the bathroom situation was small and foul. And on top of that, you could be traveling for weeks in one of these things. And that was pretty much everyone's experience with trains. But one of the only exceptions at the time was a train called the Sunset Limited. So the Sunset Limited is one of the oldest trains in the United States. It's been in operation since 1894, and it's actually still around today. And it was so popular at the time because you could take it any time of the year, no matter what the weather, what day it was. Yeah, it was great. So it was just like a very popular option. Now, the Sunset Limited was described as America's only coast-to-coast train, so you could take this thing from Louisiana all the way to Los Angeles, from the beach to Mardi Gras, just like that. And it used to be a sleeper train, so passengers, they could upgrade, and they could essentially get like their own little hotel room on wheels. It was like an experience, a nicer experience. With the Sunset Limited, you'd get to wherever you needed to go in a matter of days versus weeks. So for the first time, you could actually pay for a better traveling experience, and many did. Then by the 70s, the train industry was just hemorrhaging money. People didn't really care what kind of leather was on the train seats, right? And train companies were just losing millions of dollars. For example, when trains were popular in 1946, about 770 million people worldwide were riding the train. But by 1964, that number had dipped to about 298 million. So it was like less than half. So the government is paying attention to what's going on with the trains. They're all losing money. So they're like, we can't have this. We can't have trains fail. They're essential for America's economy. So they felt like they needed to step in and do something. So the government, they step in and they create a government-funded railroad company. It's called Amtrak. I know. Look, this alone blew my mind. I didn't know Amtrak was government funded. You learn something new every day if you just try. Okay, so Amtrak. Amtrak, they took over almost every single train company in America. And they even took over the legendary Sunset Limited. But now that Amtrak was in charge, things were different. It's government funded. They don't like to have fun or spend money. There was now an Amtrak pass, for example, which was essentially like a bus pass, but for trains. So that gave people access to a whole bunch of different trains in different cities. And people started taking the train again, just for like the adventure, not necessarily to commute back and forth to work. Great. It was kind of like you could just go to a new city the same day, like quickly. It's a whole new world. Everything's opening up. I forgot we're talking about the Big Bayou situation, right? Okay, so our story about the Big Bayou accident all starts with a man named Willie Odom. Now, Willie was the pilot of a towboat. And I know, a pilot of a towboat? I know what you're thinking. Bailey, pilot planes? I didn't know it had to do with boats, but it does. A pilot works actually for the captain, and they should both be able to direct the boat. The more you know, again, a pilot can drive a boat. But it kind of had me thinking, like, imagine if a guy on Hinge, like in his bio is like, I'm a pilot. And then you go on a date with him and he brings you to like a towboat. And then like, he's not even in charge. He's second runner up. I would be a little thrown off. On September 21st, 1993, Willie was piloting a boat called the Mauvilla. Now, the Mauvilla was towing 6 barges, and a barge is like a big, like a shipping container kind of, and each of them are thousands of pounds. So the 6 barges were attached to the main boat, the Mauvilla that Willie was driving. You got it? Good. So this was going to be an overnight ride. So Willie and the boat's captain were like taking shifts, like you sleep, I'll stay up, and then I'll sleep, and then you stay up. You get it. So sometime in the early hours of the morning, it's Willie's turn to get up. So he gets up and he takes over steering Villa. It's early and Willie's trying to like wake up. You got that like sleepy brain fog. And when he finally comes to, he realizes that he really has no idea where the hell they were. On top of that, it was extremely foggy outside, so he couldn't really see any direction. Well, what Willie didn't know was that the Villa had gone off course, and he was not prepared for this. His guidance system wasn't working, and on top of that, he didn't even have a map. I know. I was like, how are you going to be in charge of a boat and you don't have a map? Isn't that like the first step of being on a boat? Have a map? No? Okay. Doesn't know where he is. Foggy, no map. 45 minutes go by. Willie's guidance system starts beeping. It's like going crazy. It's letting him know that there's a boat up ahead. Now this is giving Willie like extreme anxiety because it's so foggy he can't see shit. Like, is he gonna run into something? I don't know. So he just keeps driving forward. Time goes by, and next thing you know, one of Villa's barges like slams into something. But Willie, he doesn't know what it slammed into, so he just kind of like keeps on boating. But what he hit was not another boat. It actually had slammed into a major bridge, the Big Bayou Canot Bridge. So at this point, Willie doesn't know two important facts. One, that barge bump, it had caused some serious damage to the bridge. And two, that this little accident would redefine the transportation industry forever. So the Villa just hit that bridge, right? And heading right towards it was a little train called, you may have guessed it, the Sunset Limited. And on that same day, September 21st, 1993, the Sunset Limited was carrying 220 passengers, and they were taking one of those famous coast-to-coast routes from Los Angeles to Miami. When the Sunset Limited stopped off in New Orleans to pick up some more passengers, it was discovered that an air conditioner on one of the cars was out, and on another car, the toilet was out of commission. And because of this, they tried to fix it, and the train was running about 30 minutes behind schedule. But they fix it all and they get on their way. At 2:53 a.m., the Sunset Limited was driving through Alabama, and its route passed right by the Big Bayou Canot Bridge. Now, at this point, the bridge had been hit by Willie's boat, but the rails themselves, they didn't break apart. Normally, a railway system will have a sensor, and if something's wrong with the tracks, it will alarm people so they know the tracks are maybe not working. But the railway system, it wasn't registering that anything was wrong with the tracks. All the conductor on the Sunset Limited saw was a green light, move forward. And sadly, he had no idea that up ahead, the tracks, they weren't broken, but the Villa had created a huge speed bump, like a ramp almost. Now, as soon as the train reached the bridge and hit those tracks, shit hit the fan. Real bad. The first train hits the newly created speed bump, flies off the frickin' bridge, crashes head first into the water below, and sadly, the train engineer in that car was killed right away. Then, two train cars full of sleeping people follow that first car, plunging straight into the water. Now, this water they were landing in was actually an Alabama bayou, which was famous for its snake-infested waters. Yeah, so that just sounds like fucking awful. Now, some of the train cars that didn't land in the water were left dangling on the collapsed bridge. And one survivor of the crash, a man named Brian Logan, described what happened. I was woken up and half thrown from my seat by the sensation of the train pitching forwards, then violently to one side. It was dark when I opened my eyes, and the next thing I remember, the passengers on my carriage were filling up the aisle and out of the train. Fuel from the dangling cars was just pouring into the water below. This caused humongous fires in the train cars. The train conductor actually managed to call 911 and was begging for any type of help that they could absolutely get. Most of the passengers didn't die right away from the impact of the crash, and people were crying out for help. And some were in the water and they couldn't even swim. Just a horrifying scene. Now, people who had survived the crash, they helped pull out as many passengers as they possibly could out of the water, but sadly, 48 people died and 103 people were injured. Most victims had died from drowning, or they were burned alive, or they died of smoke inhalation. Willie never emotionally recovered from what happened. His children even said that he suffered from PTSD and night terrors. He reportedly could still see the fires and the bodies in the water. Right after the crash, he was investigated, but eventually cleared of any criminal charges. That's because an organization called the National Transportation Safety Board released a report saying the root of the cause wasn't necessarily Willie's fault. First, Willie wasn't trained properly on how to navigate the waters under bad weather conditions. And second, the US Coast Guard didn't have a high standard when it came to giving out licenses to operate boats that could maybe cause major damage. So he wasn't necessarily the one who should have been operating the boat. So this was just a tragedy all around, but the public was even more horrified once they found out that this accident could have totally been avoided. The Big Bayou Canot Bridge had something called a, quote, unfinished swaying capability, which essentially means if something were to hit the bridge, the structure would be compromised because there wasn't a way for the boat to pass the bridge safely without breaking something. And that's exactly what happened. Plus, investigators found out that if the train hadn't been delayed by 30 minutes in New Orleans, they would have passed the Mauville before it hit the bridge. Honestly, I just feel like that's like rubbing salt in a wound, right? It's like, oh, if only you weren't late, your fault. The Mauville immediately turned around and helped to do what they could to get survivors out of the fiery waters. And Willie himself ended up saving 17 people from the crash. In the months after the crash, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and even freaking Amtrak promised to create safer transportation rules so none of this would ever happen again. They did make some changes, like adding better radars to those boats so it would be more clear when a boat is about to hit, a bridge, But of course, it's a little frustrating because why does it take a tragedy for these things to get solved?